She came out of the brush at dawn limping so badly her left boot dragged through the dirt with every step. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, her hair caked with mud, and a dark bruise had closed her right eye halfway shut. But her hands were steady. 3 sets of reins wrapped tight around her fists. 3 horses walked behind her one after another, calm and obedient like she'd been leading them all her life. The whole ranch stood still. Nobody said a word. Because those were Nate Mercer's horses. And every man there had sworn they were gone. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The summer of 1873 had not been kind to Mercer Creek Ranch. And Nate Mercer had not been kind to himself about it. The government remount contract was 3 weeks out. The inspector would arrive from Cheyenne expecting 3 horses, Dominion cannon, and Ghost ready for military service. Calm under fire, steady under load, responsive to command. Instead, what Nate had in his far corral was 3 animals that had already put 2 of his best men on their backs in the dirt and terrorized the rest into working the fence line with long poles rather than getting close enough to use their hands. 6 weeks of training. 6 weeks of Silas Boone working those horses the only way he knew how, loud, fast, and brutal. And every week they had gotten worse instead of better. Nobody expected the woman to walk through the front gate at noon on a Tuesday. She came in from the east road moving slow and deliberate. One hand gripping the leather of a cavalry saddle she carried across her left shoulder like it weighed nothing, though it clearly did. Her dress was the color of old ash, torn at the hem and dark with sweat. Her boots were worn clean through at the right toe. Her hair had come loose from its pins hours ago and hung damp against her neck, and she walked with the particular economy of someone who had been on her feet far too long and refused to let it show. Caleb Pike was the first one to see her. He was 16 years old and mucking stalls near the front corral, and he stopped dead pitchfork in hand, mouth open. "There's a woman," he said mostly to himself. "I can see that," Silas Boone said from behind him. The foreman had been leaning against the fence post, reviewing a list of supplies, but he straightened when he saw her, and his eyes went narrow and very cold. Silas was a big man, broad-chested, thick-handed, the kind of man who had spent his whole life making sure he was the largest thing in any room he walked into. He stepped forward as Clara approached the gate, and he planted himself square in the middle of it, thumbs in his belt, like a wall that had decided to have a personality. "We don't need anything you're selling," he said. "I'm not selling anything," Clara said. She stopped in front of him. Her eyes moved across the yard with a quietness that Caleb found unsettling. Not the nervous glance of a woman checking for danger, but the careful reading of someone taking inventory. She was looking at the horses in the corral, he realized, not the men. "I'm looking for the foreman or whoever does the hiring," she said. "You found the foreman," Silas said. "And I already gave you the answer." "You gave me an answer before I asked a question." "Then ask it so I can say no proper." She looked at him steadily. "My name is Clara Whitmore. I'm out of Cheyenne. My husband passed 2 winters ago. I've spent the better part of 20 years around cavalry horses breaking gentling remount preparation. I heard Mercer Creek has a government contract coming up and 3 horses that won't cooperate. You heard wrong? The sorrel in the corner corral says otherwise." She nodded toward the far fence without looking away from Silas. "He's been circling the same 8-foot pattern since I came through that gate. That's not a difficult horse. That's a frightened one. Someone used chain work on him. He's not fighting people anymore. He's trying to survive them. There's a difference, and that difference matters when you're trying to ready an animal for military service." Silas stared at her. A muscle jumped in his jaw. "Who told you that?" he said. "Nobody told me. I looked." The sound of bootsteps on the porch made both of them turn. Nate Mercer had come out of the house without either of them noticing, which was a thing he could do, move quietly for a man his size, arrive at the edge of a situation before anyone realized he was coming. He held a coffee cup in one hand and stood on the top porch step, looking down at them with an expression that gave away nothing. He was broad through the shoulders and lean everywhere else, with a face that had left its youth behind, not from age, but from something heavier, the kind of gravity that came from carrying something for a long time. "What's the situation?" he said, not a question. "No situation," Silas said quickly. "Woman's looking for horsework. I told her we don't have any." "I didn't ask you." Nate looked at Clara. "Chainwork on the sorrel. How'd you read that?" "The way he holds his head up when he backs away," Clara said. "And the scar tissue at the corner of his mouth." He learned early on that if he raised his nose when the pressure came, the pain was less. "He's not being willful. He's remembering." She paused. "Horses don't forget. They just learn to manage." Nate was quiet for a moment. Then he came down the porch steps slow and unhurried, and stopped in front of her with his coffee cup still in his hand, looking at the saddle she carried. "That's a cavalry rig," he said. "It was my father's." "Where'd he serve?" Clara's eyes were steady and direct. "Third Cavalry. He's been gone 3 years." Something moved across Nate's face, brief, unreadable there, and then controlled. He looked at the corral, then back at her. "My foreman's been working 3 horses for the remount contract since early June," he said. "We're 3 weeks from inspection, and those animals will barely take a halter without a fight." He glanced at Silas with an expression that wasn't quite accusation, but wasn't far from it. "What would you do differently?" "I'd start by not doing what's been done to them," Clara said. Silas made a sound low in his chest. "Now listen here." "Silas." Nate's voice was quiet, but it carried the particular weight of a man who did not repeat himself. "Go check on the south fence." "Nate, you're not seriously going to—" "South fence, Silas." The foreman left. But the look he gave Clara as he passed her, slow, measuring cold as creek water in January, made the back of her neck prickle. Nate turned back to her. "There's a black stallion in the far corral. Name's Dominion. He's put 3 men down in the last month. One of them left on a wagon." He set his coffee cup on the fence rail. "You go in there, no rope, no whip, and you get your hand flat on his neck without him throwing you. You've got a 2-week trial. Fair wage. Room near the wash house." He paused. "You can't do it, you walk back the way you came. We understand each other." "We do," Clara said. She set the cavalry saddle down against the fence post, adjusted her sleeves, and said, "Show me which corral." Dominion was 17 hands of pure black muscle and bad history, and he had not had a single reason in his entire life to trust a human being who walked toward him on purpose. He paced the far corral with his ears pinned flat, eyes showing white at the corners, and every time any of the hands drifted close to the fence boards, he charged all 1,000+ pounds of him hitting the rail like a warning. Caleb stood beside Nate outside the gate and said very quietly, "She's going to get hurt." "She might," Nate said. "You're going to let her." "She knows the terms. She asked for the chance." Caleb looked at him. "You're really going to stand there and watch?" "I'm going to watch what she does," Nate said. "There's a difference." Clara did not rush. She stood outside the corral gate for a long time, long enough that 2 of the older hands drifted over from other work, curious and skeptical, and waiting for the thing that always happened when someone new tried dominion. She watched the horse's breathing, the rhythm of his circling, the way his weight shifted before each charge, which shoulder dropped, which hind leg he loaded. Then she opened the gate and stepped inside. She did not look at Dominion directly. She angled her body sideways, made herself small, moved to the center of the corral at an oblique angle, and stopped. Her hands hung loose at her sides. She looked at the ground 6 feet ahead of her. Dominion charged. Every man at the fence yanked back. Someone said a word that Ruth Bell would have taken issue with. Clara did not run. She did not raise her arms. She pivoted just her body just enough and let the horse rush past her close enough that his shoulder nearly clipped hers. And when Dominion wheeled and came again, she moved with him, matching the curve of his circle, slow and deliberate, like a woman with nowhere else to be. "What in the—" Caleb started. "She's not opposing him," Nate said. He leaned on the fence rail with both arms and watched with the focused attention of a man who recognized strategy when he saw it. "She's moving with him, making herself part of his circle instead of a thing standing in the way of it. It took 40 minutes. Dominion charged 4 more times. Each time Clara moved with him instead of against him. Each time she held her ground without flinching, without hardening, without anger, or at least without showing any. She spoke to the horse in a low, even voice, too quiet for the men at the fence to hear the words. Just the rhythm of it, steady as a heartbeat, steady as a woman who had learned that the only way through some kinds of fear was to stop running from it. And then the horse stopped. He stood in the middle of the corral, breathing hard through flared nostrils, watching her with ears that had shifted from flatback to something more like a question. Dominion, the horse that had put 3 men in the dirt, standing still. Clara walked toward him. 1 step, 2, 5, slow as rising water. She lifted her hand and pressed it flat, open-palmed against the side of his neck. The horse held still. The fence was silent. Not the silence of nothing happening, but the silence of men who had seen something they did not have words for yet. Silas Boone, who had returned from the south fence much faster than he should have, stood at the far corner of the fence line and said, "Horse just wore himself out. That's all that is." Nobody answered him. Nate Mercer stood at the rail and looked at Clara Whitmore with her worn gray dress and her steady hands and her palm flat against the neck of the most dangerous animal on his property. And he felt something move behind his sternum that he hadn't felt in long enough that he'd half convinced himself he'd lost the capacity for it. He didn't know what to do with that yet, so he didn't do anything. "Caleb," he said, "show Mrs. Whitmore to the room near the washhouse." Clara worked before sunrise and after dark. She had learned that was the safest way to already be present when the men arrived, already productive when they left, so that her existence on the property became a fact rather than a question. Facts were harder to argue with than decisions. She started with Dominion every morning before the heat settled in and made everything irritable. She added Ghost, the steel-gray mare, by the end of the first week. The mare's trouble was different from the stallion's. Dominion raged, but Ghost froze, locking all 4 legs and going rigid with terror at the sight of anything that moved behind her. It took Clara 3 sessions to understand why. "Somebody tied you to a wagon," she said to the mare one morning, working with just a rope halter, and her voice no tools, nothing that jingled or dragged. "And the wagon went somewhere bad. And now every time something moves behind you, you're already back in that ditch." She kept her voice low and even, moving slow circles around the mare's hindquarters, close enough to be present, far enough not to crowd. "But you're not going back to that ditch. You hear me? I won't let anything pull you there again." Ghost's ear turned toward her voice. "You and me both," Clara said softly and kept working. By the second week, all 3 horses were moving clean under a saddle. The hands who'd written Clara off by Wednesday of the first week were finding reasons to be near the training corral by the second. Ruth Bell noticed everything. She brought Clara her supper on the 4th evening, set the plate on the fence rail, and sat down beside it with the ease of a woman who had stopped worrying about appearances somewhere around her 40th birthday. "You know horses," Ruth said. "I do," Clara said. "Your husband teach you?" A brief pause. "No." Ruth looked at her sideways. "Your father?" It wasn't quite a question. Clara met her eyes. "He trained cavalry horses for the 3rd for 20 years. Best horseman I ever saw. He used to say that a frightened horse and a frightened person have the same problem. They've both been taught that the world is something to survive instead of something to live in." "Good man," Ruth said. "The best I knew." Clara's voice stayed steady. Her hands did not. Ruth watched that and said nothing about it. Instead, she said, "Silas has been asking around about you in town." Clara's hands stilled on the rope she was repairing. "What kind of asking?" "The unfriendly kind. He went to the telegraph office. Asked the man there whether any widow from Cheyenne had filed a property claim recently. Asked the county sheriff if there were any outstanding reports of stolen cavalry equipment." The blood left Clara's face. She kept her expression flat, through an effort of will she didn't entirely have to spare. "And he came back empty." Ruth took a biscuit from her apron pocket, broke it in two, and offered Clara half. Nothing to find, because there's nothing to find. But the fact that he looked tells you something about what he's planning. He wants to get rid of me. He wants a reason to, Ruth said. That's different. Silas doesn't act without cover. He needs a story. Right now he doesn't have one. She chewed her biscuit thoughtfully. What he does have is your saddle. He talks about it. Says no widow from Pennsylvania would have a cavalry rig unless she stole it or lied about who she was. Clara looked out at the corral where Dominion stood quiet in the early evening. He's not wrong that I lied, she said carefully. My husband was a bookkeeper. He never went near a horse in his life. The saddle was my father's. I said it was my husband's because nobody was going to hire the daughter of a cavalry sergeant, Ruth said. They'd hire the widow of one. Widows need things. Daughters are just women who want things. There's a difference in how people hear it. Yes. Well? Ruth stood and brushed her skirt. I didn't hear anything tonight that I'm going to repeat to anybody, but you should know what's coming. She picked up the empty supper plate. Watch your tools. Watch the corral gates at night. And keep that saddle where you can see it. She paused at the fence rail. Silas Boone has been the most important man on this ranch for 6 years. Every day you walk into that corral and those horses follow you without a whip, you take a piece of that away from him. Men who are afraid of losing what they've built are capable of a great deal. She walked back toward the house. Clara sat alone in the warm evening and turned Ruth's words over in her mind and thought about fear, how it wore so many faces, how it dressed itself up in cruelty and authority and entitlement, so that it didn't have to look like what it was. She had grown up watching her father gentle animals out of fear. She had never been entirely sure the skill didn't apply to people too. She didn't sleep well that night. The night the horses were stolen, the moon was buried under cloud cover, and the wind had come up hard from the north carrying the smell of a storm 2 days out. Clara woke at midnight to silence. That was what did it. The silence. Dominion had a habit she'd cataloged in her first week, a slow, restless walk in his stall after midnight, hooves on packed dirt, back and forth, 3 steps and a turn. She'd grown so accustomed to that sound that its absence hit her the way a missing heartbeat hits a doctor. She was upright and reaching for her boots before she was fully awake. Outside, the air was thick and warm and still. She moved to the main stable and stopped. The corral gate stood open. She went inside. Dominion's stall. Empty. Ghost's stall. Empty. Cannon's the third horse, a compact sorrel gelding built like a hammer, gone. Clara stood in the dark and made herself think instead of panic. She crouched and looked at the dirt near the gate. The tracks were fresh. 2 riders on horseback pushing the 3 horses hard heading east. The gate latch hadn't been broken, it had been opened. Someone with a key or someone who knew where the key was kept. She looked at the tracks for a long moment. East meant the canyon pass. The canyon pass in the dark, with 3 horses being pushed hard, would slow them. The trail narrowed before the second bend, and the footing was loose shale. Anyone who didn't know it would lose 10 minutes navigating. She knew it. She'd ridden it 6 times in 2 weeks. She did the math in her head. They had maybe 50 minutes on her. The pass would cost them 15. That left 35. If she went to the house, Woke Nate got the men saddled and organized, and moving those 35 minutes would become nothing. The horses would be sold before breakfast. The government contract 3 weeks out, the one contract between Nate's men, and a winter without wages, would be gone. Clara went back to her room and got the cavalry saddle. She did not knock on Nate Mercer's door. She did not wake Caleb or any of the other hands. She took Patch, a rough little dun gelding that belonged to the general population of the ranch and had no particular attachment to comfort or opinion, threw the cavalry saddle on him in 60 seconds flat, and rode out the east gate without a lantern, because a lantern would let the rustlers see her coming. It was not a brave thing. It was a mathematical thing. Her father had taught her that courage and calculation were not opposites. Courage was just calculation without the luxury of time to be afraid. She rode into the dark and didn't look back. Caleb Pike found the empty stalls at 4 in the morning and shouted loud enough to wake the dogs. By the time Nate came out of the house pulling on his coat, the yard was full of noisemen talking over each other, lanterns swinging questions without answers. Nate cut through it the way he cut through most things, by stopping in the middle of it and being very still until the noise organized itself around his silence. 3 horses gone, Caleb said out of breath, half his shirt still untucked. Dominion ghost cannon. Corral gate was open, and Mrs. Whitmore's room. He stopped. What about it? She's not in it. Her saddle's gone. The yard went quieter than it had been. Nate looked at Silas Boone, who was standing near the empty corral, with an expression that Nate had been looking at for 6 years, and only now, in the particular quality of this moment noticed, was not quite right. Not alarmed. Not even surprised, really. More like a man arriving at a place he already knew existed. Who had the night watch? Nate said. I put Garrett on it, Silas said immediately. He didn't show. Nothing I could do about that. Where is Garrett now? Silence. Where is Garrett, Silas? Don't know. He was on the payroll this morning. Nate looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the tracks near the gate, crouched down, read them the way Clara had read them an hour earlier. East 2 riders, 3 horses moving fast. Get the men mounted, he said. Nate, those tracks are an hour old. They could be through the pass by. Get the men mounted. He stood. Now, Silas went. And from the kitchen doorway, Ruth Bell stood in her dressing gown with a lamp in her hand and watched the foreman move through the yard, and the expression on her face was not surprise either, but it was a very different kind of not surprised. They were an hour east of the ranch, moving by torchlight along the canyon trail, when Caleb pulled his horse up short and said, "Something's coming." The shape came out of the brush at the edge of the trail, slowly moving on foot, limping heavily on the left side, with every step dragging that boot through the dirt, the way a person does when they've pushed past the point where pain is a consideration, and have arrived at the simpler country, where the only thing left is forward. 3 horses followed her, one after another, quiet as church, reins wrapped around her fists. Nate pulled up and held his torch and stared. The light fell across Clara Whitmore's face. Her right eye was swollen half shut. Her dress was torn clean through at the shoulder. Mud had dried in her hair and cracked along her jaw. She was breathing through her mouth with the controlled effort of someone managing something serious, and her left leg moved wrong, not broken, but not right either. And her hands, wrapped in those reins knuckles scraped and bleeding at 2 fingers, were not shaking. Behind her, Dominion walked as calm as a horse in a Sunday parade. Ghost, cannon, all 3, alive, uninjured. Nobody spoke. Nate dismounted. He walked toward her, and the closer he got, the clearer it became that the only thing holding Clara Whitmore vertical right now was a decision she had made and intended to honor. And that decision had nothing to do with strength anymore, and everything to do with stubbornness. And he recognized it because he had made that same decision himself, in different circumstances, more times than he could count. He stopped in front of her. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Mercer," she said. The wind moved between them. "You went after them alone." "Someone had to." "You could have woken me." "By the time you had men saddled and moving, they'd have been through the pass." Her voice was steady, level. "I knew the trail. I knew where they were going. I had a faster path through the East Ridge." She looked at him straight on. "I calculated the odds. The odds said go." "The odds—" He said something rough and unsteady, moving under his voice. "Also included you getting killed." "They did," she said. "I factored that in too." He stood there looking at her, this woman with mud in her hair and blood on her hands, and 3 stolen horses breathing warm behind her in the Wyoming dark. And he said very quietly, like the words cost him something, "Are you all right?" Clara Whitmore looked up at Nathaniel Mercer, and something in her expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but opened just enough just for a moment, the way a door opens an inch in a house that's been locked for a long time. "I will be," she said. He reached out and took the reins from her hands. All 3 sets careful and deliberate, so she didn't have to let go so much as just stop holding on. And for the first time since she'd walked through the gate of Mercer Creek Ranch with a cavalry saddle on her shoulder and nothing else to her name, Clara let someone take something from her without protest, because her hands finally were shaking, and she was too tired to pretend they weren't. Nate did not ask whether she could walk back on her own. He simply moved to her left side, put his hand under her elbow and said, "Lean on me." Not a question. Not an offer. A fact delivered the same way he delivered every fact, quiet and final, and not particularly interested in debate. Clara's first instinct was to say she was fine. She didn't. Because she wasn't, and because lying about it would have cost her more energy than she had. So she leaned, and she let him take some of her weight, and she told herself it was practical, and not anything else. They walked back toward the ranch like that, Nate steady and unhurried at her side. 3 horses trailing behind on the reins he'd taken from her, and the rest of the men following at a respectful distance that had more to do with the expression on Nate Mercer's face than any sense of delicacy. Caleb led Patch the dun gelding and didn't say a word the whole way, which for Caleb was unprecedented. Silas Boone rode ahead. He did not look back once. Ruth Bell was waiting at the front gate with a lamp, even though the sky was just beginning to show color in the east. She had the look of a woman who had heard the horses coming from half a mile out and had spent the intervening time preparing, rather than worrying towels over one arm, a basin of water already visible through the wash-house door behind her. She took one look at Clara and said, "Inside, now." "The horses need—" "The horses," Ruth said, "have 6 men who can handle them. Inside." Clara went inside. Nate stood in the yard and watched her go, and something worked in his jaw, a slow tightening that Caleb noticed and chose not to comment on. "What do you want done with these 3? Caleb asked, meaning the recovered horses, stroking Dominion's nose. "Stable them. Check them over. I want to know if any of them are hurt." Nate paused. "Do it yourself. Don't ask Silas." Caleb looked at him. "You think he—" "I think I want you to do it yourself," Nate said. "That's all I'm saying right now." Ruth cleaned the cut above Clara's eye with the particular efficiency of a woman who had tended ranch injuries for 15 years and had no patience for wincing. Clara sat on the edge of the wash-house cot and submitted to it without complaint, which told Ruth more about how tired she was than anything else. "The leg," Ruth said. "Twisted. Not broken. I'll decide that." Ruth ran her hands along Clara's left ankle with practiced pressure, and Clara made a sound through her teeth but held still. "Twisted," Ruth confirmed. "Badly. You'll feel it for 2 weeks." She began wrapping it tight with strips of linen. "You want to tell me what happened out there?" 2 men. They'd made the canyon pass and were trying to push the horses through the east break when I came up behind them. The footing on that ridge is bad in the dark. They didn't know it. I did. And the eye? The taller one had fast hands. Clara paused. "I had faster feet. Once." Ruth snorted. It was almost a laugh. "You got the horses back." "That was the point." "You could have been killed." "People keep saying that to me," Clara said. "I'm starting to feel like it's supposed to mean something different than it does." Ruth tied off the bandage and sat back on her heels and looked at Clara with those sharp eyes of hers. The eyes that read people, the way Clara read horses, looking for the thing beneath the thing. "You went out there alone in the dark," she said. "Not because nobody else was available. Because you decided the ranch needed those horses more than it needed you to be careful." Clara looked at her hands. "The contract's in 3 weeks. Without Dominion Ghost and Cannon, Nate loses everything he negotiated for. His men lose wages. The ranch loses its standing with the government buyers." She flexed her fingers, checking the cuts. "I could do something about that, so I did." "And Nate Mercer? What about him?" "You did it for the ranch," Ruth said. "That's what you just told me." Clara said nothing. Ruth stood, dried her hands on a towel, and said without looking at her, "He held your arm the whole way back from the canyon trail. Nate Mercer hasn't done that for another person since his wife died. She moved toward the door. Get some sleep. I'll bring breakfast when the sun's properly up. She went out and shut the door behind her, and Clara sat alone in the early dawn quiet and stared at the bandage on her ankle, and told herself very firmly that it didn't mean what Ruth was implying. She was almost convincing. She woke up 2 hours later to the sound of raised voices in the yard. She knew Silas Boone's voice before she was fully awake. She'd been calibrating herself to it since her first morning on the ranch, the way you learn the sound of a thing that might be dangerous before you learn what it actually wants. She pulled on her boots, gritted through the pain in her ankle, and made it to the wash-house door in time to hear him say clearly and carrying, "I'm just saying what every man here is thinking. 2 riders steal 3 horses. Our woman just happens to go after them alone in the dark. And she just happens to know exactly where they were going." The yard was full. 8-10 men, most of the ranch hands drawn by whatever Silas had started before Clara opened the door. Nate was standing with his back to the stable wall, arms crossed, and his face was doing the thing it did when he was listening hard and showing nothing. Clara stepped out of the wash-house. The yard went quiet. Silas turned, and for just a second, a half second, barely something moved across his face that wasn't surprise. Then it was gone, and he was looking at her with what passed for concern. "Mrs. Whitmore, you should be resting." "I heard what you said," Clara said. "Did you?" He spread his hands, generous, reasonable. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm raising a question that needs raising. Those rustlers knew exactly which horses to take. Dominion Ghost Cannon, the 3 contract horses, not the other 12 animals on this property, just those 3. He looked around at the gathered men, making sure they were with him. "Who else on this ranch knew which 3 horses mattered for the contract?" "You did," Clara said. "You've known for 6 weeks. A murmur moved through the yard. Silas smiled with his mouth only. "I'm the foreman. Of course I knew. The question is, who else?" "Every hand on this property knew," Clara said. "You announced the contract terms at supper your first week back from Cheyenne. I heard you from the wash-house." She looked at the men. "So did most of you." A few of the older hands shifted their feet. One of them, a man named Decker, who had been on the ranch longer than anyone, nodded once slowly. Silas kept his smile. "Still, a woman goes out alone in the dark, comes back with the horses, and nobody saw the rustlers leave. Nobody saw them caught. Nothing but her word." "And 3 horses," Clara said, "that are standing in that stable right now, which could have been hidden nearby and walked back at first light." Silas. Nate's voice was quiet, and it cut through everything. "That's enough. I said enough." Nate uncrossed his arms and stepped forward, and the men moved back slightly, the way they always did when Nate Mercer moved toward something with intent. Mrs. Whitmore rode out alone into the dark and brought back 3 horses that represent the majority of this ranch's income for the next year. She came back injured. She came back on foot. He stopped close enough to Silas that it was a statement. "You came back from the south fence last night in under 20 minutes. That fence is 40 minutes out and 40 minutes back on a good day." He waited. "Where'd the time go, Silas?" The yard was very still. Silas's jaw tightened. "I rode fast. The horses were missing. You weren't worried," Nate said. "I've known you 6 years. I know what worried looks like on you. Last night didn't look like worried." He stepped back. "We're going to talk about this later, in private." He looked at the men. "Get back to work." They went. Silas went. And as he passed Clara, he didn't look at her, didn't threaten her, didn't say a word. Which was she was discovering when Silas Boone was most dangerous, when he stopped making noise. Caleb found her in the stable at mid-morning, sitting on an overturned bucket outside Dominion's stall, her wrapped ankle stretched out in front of her, watching the horse eat. "You're supposed to be resting," he said. "I'm sitting," she said. "It's restful." He lowered himself onto the straw bale nearby with the slightly formal care of a boy who wanted to say something and hadn't worked out exactly how. He was quiet for a minute. Then he said, "I didn't believe him. What Silas said. I want you to know that." Clara looked at him sideways. "Thank you, Caleb." Some of the others, Henderson, maybe Briggs, they were listening to him. I could see it. He picked at a piece of straw. People want a story they can understand. A woman does something like what you did last night and they don't know how to put it in a box, so they reach for a box that fits. He said it the way a 16-year-old says things he's working out while saying them not perfectly, but honestly. "That's very wise for someone your age," Clara said. He went red to the ears. "I ain't wise. My mother was the one who ran our farm after my father died. 3 years alone, and half the county talked about her the whole time. Said she'd lose the place by winter. Said a woman couldn't manage it." He shrugged, pulling the bale apart with his hands. "She's still there. Farm's still there. The county talks about something else now." Clara said, "Your mother sounds like a practical woman." "She'd like you," Caleb said simply. They sat with that for a minute. Dominion finished his grain and swung his big head toward the stall door, and Clara reached up without thinking and scratched the spot behind his ear that she'd found on day 3, and the horse pressed into it with the dumb bliss of a 1,000-pound animal, discovering that being touched could feel like something other than danger. "Mrs. Whitmore," Caleb said. "The man on the left, the taller rustler. Did you see his face?" Clara was very still for a moment. "It was dark." "But you got close enough to fight him." "Yes." "Did you see anything? A mark, a brand, anything that could—" "Why are you asking?" Clara said. Caleb looked at his hands. "Because Garrett's gone. The night watch who didn't show. He's Silas's cousin. Moved here 8 months ago when Silas brought him on." He said it quietly, like a thing he'd been holding and wasn't sure he was supposed to release. "I've been thinking about that all morning." Clara reached into her dress pocket and held out her closed fist. Caleb opened his hand beneath hers, and she dropped into it a brass belt buckle, heavy, engraved the shape of it, distinctive in a way that was clearly personal rather than standard issue. One side was bent, like it had taken a blow. "I pulled this off the bigger man in the struggle," Clara said. "Before he ran." Caleb stared at it. His face changed. "I've seen this before," he said slowly. "Or one like it. Silas had a man here 3 weeks back, a man from Laramie who sat in the bunkhouse and ate our food for 2 days, and Silas called him an old friend." Clara said, "Keep that safe. Don't show Silas. Don't tell anyone but Nate, and only when the time is right." "When is the time right?" "When there's no way for it to disappear," Clara said. "Proof without a witness is just an object. We need the witness first." Caleb closed his hand around the buckle and nodded once with a seriousness that made him look briefly 10 years older than he was. They found Garrett at 2 in the afternoon. Not dead, which was the first thought, the bad one, the one that ran through the yard like a current, when the farmer from the neighboring property rode in with a wagon and a man laid in the back of it on a blanket. Garrett was alive, but barely, his face beaten past recognition, his right arm broken, his breathing the shallow, careful work of a man whose ribs were not where they were supposed to be. The farmer, whose name was Aldous Greer, said he'd found him in the canyon, not near the pass where the rustlers had gone but further south in the rocky wash. Like he'd been left there deliberately. Hidden. Nate had him carried inside to the bunkhouse. Silas stood in the doorway of the bunkhouse and said, "Lord, what happened to him?" in a voice so perfectly calibrated to shock that Clara, watching from 20 feet away, felt her stomach drop. Because perfect calibration was exactly the problem. Real shock didn't sound like that. Real shock missed a beat. Ruth was already beside Garrett, her hands moving fast and efficient, checking for what could be managed and what couldn't. She looked up at Nate and shook her head slightly, not the worst, but close. Nate crouched beside the bunk. "Garrett," he said. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. Breathing. "Garrett, who did this to you?" A long silence. The kind that everyone in the room held their breath through, and then Garrett's lips moved. Clara pushed forward without thinking, getting close enough to hear. The word was mangled by the state of his mouth, but it was there clear enough. One word. A name. His lips shaped it, and Clara heard it, and she looked up and met Nate's eyes across the body of the unconscious man, and knew that Nate had heard it too. Silas, standing in the doorway, said, "Did he say something I couldn't make it out?" "No," Nate said without looking at him. "Nothing yet." It was the first time Clara had heard Nate Mercer lie. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. But something passed between them in that moment, an understanding shared and wordless, that what they had just heard could not be safely spoken in the room they were currently standing in. Nate came to the stable after supper. Clara was working a section of bridle by lamplight, sitting on the same overturned bucket, and she heard his boots on the stable floor before she saw him. She had learned the sound of his walk. She hadn't decided what to do with that information yet. He sat down on the straw bale across from her, the same one Caleb had used that morning, and put his elbows on his knees, and didn't say anything for a moment. "He said Silas," Clara said, because someone had to say it. "Yes." He said it clearly. "He did." Nate turned his hat in his hands. "That's not proof. A man in that condition, in that much pain, a defense lawyer would take it apart in 20 minutes. "I know." Clara kept her hands on the bridle working the leather, because keeping her hands busy helped her think. "But you believe him." Nate was quiet. Then, "I've been going over 6 years in my head tonight. Small things. Things that didn't quite add up, and I explained away because Silas was good at his job, and I didn't want to look at what else he might be." He turned the hat again. "Horses that got worse under his training instead of better. Tools that went missing and turned up damaged. Men who left the ranch suddenly and said they'd found other work, but the leaving was always fast, and always when they'd been getting close to something Silas wanted kept quiet." He exhaled. "I've been willfully blind." "You trusted your foreman," Clara said. "That's not blindness. That's reasonable." "Same thing in the end." She looked at him. "What will you do?" "I can't fire him without proof. He'll go to the county sheriff and make a case that I dismissed him based on the word of a woman who showed up 2 weeks ago with a story and a cavalry saddle." He said it flatly, without inflection, but the phrase "a cavalry saddle" landed on Clara's sternum with particular weight. "He'll burn the contract deal, the reputation, everything, and then he'll leave and take Garrett's word with him." Clara set the bridle down. "Caleb has something," she said. "A belt buckle. Pulled from one of the rustlers. He recognized the design, a man who visited Silas 3 weeks ago. A man from Laramie." Nate looked at her. "You took it off the man you fought." "Yes." "And you gave it to Caleb." "I trusted him not to lose it or be talked out of it." She met his eyes. "I wasn't sure yet who else that applied to." A silence. Not a comfortable one. The kind where someone is deciding whether to be insulted and concludes it wouldn't be entirely fair. "You weren't sure about me," Nate said. "You have known Silas Boone for 6 years," Clara said. "I've been here 2 weeks. I didn't know what you'd do with evidence against your foreman. Now I do." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, not offense exactly. Something more complicated than that. "You calculate everything," he said. "My father taught me to." "Tell me about your father." The question landed quiet and direct, and without warning, the way his questions always did, and Clara's hands, which had been still on the bridle, went still in a different way. The kind of still that is a decision. "He was a good man," she said. "A patient man. He spent his whole life teaching horses and soldiers how to trust each other, and he died." She stopped, chose carefully. "He died doing what he believed in, serving." "3rd Cavalry," Nate said. "Yes." "What was his name?" And there it was. The question she had been waiting for and dreading since the day she'd walked through the gate. She felt it the way you feel a splinter that's been in too long, not just the pain of it, but the awareness of everything that removing it would require. "Whitmore," she said. His name was Whitmore. Which was true. Which was also not the answer he was asking for. Nate looked at her with those dark, weighted eyes, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he knew she'd answered a different question than the one he'd asked. But he didn't push. He picked up his hat and stood. "Get some rest," he said. "I want you back on those horses tomorrow. Government inspection got moved." Clara looked up sharply. "Moved how?" "A week earlier. Message came this afternoon." His voice was steady, but she heard the thing underneath it, the controlled version of alarm that came from a man who had made peace with bad news enough times to know how to stand next to it without flinching. 2 weeks from tomorrow, inspectors coming to Mercer Creek directly instead of routing through Cheyenne. He looked at the stable. "Those horses need to be ready, which means you need to be ready." "I'll be ready," she said. He nodded once, left. Clara sat in the lamplight for a long time after he was gone, the bridle in her lap, and turned over the last 20 minutes like a stone she wasn't sure she should flip. The contract moved up. Silas suspected, but not yet stopped. Garrett barely alive in the bunkhouse, and Garrett's word worth nothing, without something more solid behind it. The buckle in Caleb's pocket. And Nate Mercer asking for her father's name with the quiet persistence of a man who was already halfway to an answer. She needed more time. She wasn't going to get it. She was at the corral at first light. Her ankles screamed with every step. She didn't stop. Ghost came to her at the fence before she even opened the gate, which 3 weeks ago would have been as likely as the sky going green. The mare pressed her nose against Clara's shoulder and blew out warm against her collar. And Clara stood there a moment with her hand on the horse's face and let herself feel it, the weight of being trusted by something that had every reason not to trust. And then she opened the gate and went in. She had 2 weeks. She intended to use all of them. Silas appeared at the corral fence at mid-morning. He didn't say anything for a while, just watched, arms on the top rail, chin resting on his forearms, with the particular quality of a man who wanted you to know he was watching. "Contract moved up," he said finally. "I heard," Clara said, working Ghost through a slow rain response, steady pressure, steady release. "That's tight timing." "It is. For anyone," Silas said. "Those horses would be tough to finish in 2 weeks. For a woman working alone with no help from my men." Clara stopped the mare. She turned and looked directly at Silas Boone for the first time since that morning in the yard. She looked at him the way she looked at a horse that was building to a charge, reading the tension, calculating the distance, deciding where to stand. "You've been pulling your men off the training schedule," she said. "I need them elsewhere. You've been putting green hands on the night stable rotation so the horses don't settle properly overnight. I assign my men where they're needed. You had Briggs rake the East Corral sand the wrong direction, so the footing was soft and uneven for the gated work." She watched his face. "That took planning. That wasn't improvised." Silas's jaw worked. "You're describing incompetence, not—" "I'm describing a man who is very carefully making sure these horses aren't ready for inspection," Clara said, "so that when they fail, it can be explained as the fault of the woman who was training them." She stepped closer to the fence. "The question I keep coming back to, Silas, is why you arranged for the horses to be stolen if you were already planning to make me fail the inspection. You didn't need both. One or the other would have done the job." She tilted her head. "Unless one of them wasn't actually about me." A silence that had teeth. "I don't know what you're talking about," Silas said. "Those rustlers were pointed specifically at this ranch," Clara said. "Specifically at those 3 horses. Not a random job, a targeted one. Which means someone with money offered to pay for those specific animals, and someone here told them which 3 to take." She didn't look away. "Garrett said your name." Something happened in Silas's face that he couldn't quite control in time. It lasted less than a second, but Clara had spent her whole life reading things that moved too fast for most people to catch. Fear. Not of Nate Mercer. Not of being fired. The deeper kind. The kind that meant consequences that went past employment. He recovered fast. He straightened, and the reasonable, aggrieved foreman face slid back into place like a mask he'd been wearing so long he'd stopped noticing the strings. "Garrett's been beaten half to death. He's barely conscious. Anything he said means nothing." He pushed off the fence. You should be careful, Mrs. Whitmore, about making accusations that you can't support. People in your position, a widow new with a past, nobody's checked, don't generally do well when things get complicated. He walked away. Clara watched him go and understood with complete clarity that the conversation she had just had was going to make the next 2 weeks very different from the last 2. She had shown him what she knew. She had done it deliberately. Because Silas Boone was careful as long as he thought he was hidden, and a careful Silas was far more dangerous than a panicking one. She needed him to make a mistake. She turned back to Ghost and picked up the reins and started again, smooth and patient and steady. And inside she was calculating distances and timing and weight, the way her father had taught her, the way she had taught herself, the way she had been doing her whole life without anyone seeing it. It was Ruth who found the saddle. Clara came back to the wash house at dusk and knew immediately that someone had been there. The cavalry saddle hung on its peg in the same position, but the leather straps had been rebuckled in a different order, left over, right where Clara always did, right over left, the way her father had done it, the way she had done it for 20 years without thinking. Someone had opened every strap and looked at every inch of that saddle. They hadn't found anything because there was nothing hidden in the leather itself. But that wasn't what turned Clara's blood cold. What turned her blood cold was that whoever had done it knew which room was hers, had walked in, handled her father's saddle, and put it back expecting her not to notice. She stood in front of the saddle for a long time. Then she reached up and touched the brass of the pommel dented on the left side from a fall in '61 that her father had told her about 4 times, always laughing at himself, always embarrassed by how it had happened. The dent was still there. Nothing had changed. The saddle was still her father's. Still Elias Whitmore's. Still the thing she had carried across half of Wyoming, because giving it up would have meant giving up the last of him. She was still holding it when Nate appeared in the doorway. He saw her face. He looked at the saddle. He looked back at her face. "Someone was in here," he said. "The straps," she said. "Different order." His expression did not change dramatically, but his eyes went very hard, very fast. "Did they take anything?" "No." "Is there something they would have been looking for?" Clara looked at the saddle, at the dented pommel, at the 3rd cavalry mark stamped into the leather just below the gullet, faint with age and handling, but there, always there. "Yes," she said. And then, because she was so tired of the particular weight of a half-truth, and because something in the way he was standing in that doorway made the full truth feel for the first time like something she might be able to put down rather than carry, she said, "Mr. Mercer, there's something I need to tell you." He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "My father's name," Clara said, his full name, was Elias Whitmore. She watched his face. She watched the name land. She watched the 6 years, or however many years it had been, arrive in his expression all at once, arriving the way old grief arrives, when something calls it back, not dramatic, not loud, just suddenly terribly present. The color left his face. His hand, which had been resting on the door behind him, went still. He said very quietly, "Elias Whitmore was your father." "Yes," Clara said. "And before you say anything else, I didn't come here for revenge. I didn't come here because of him. I came here because I needed work and I heard there was a contract deadline and horses that needed gentling." She held her voice steady by an effort of will. "But I should have told you the truth from the start. And I didn't. And whatever you do with that is your right." Nate Mercer stood in the doorway of the wash house in the last light of a Wyoming evening, and the look on his face was not what Clara had expected. She had braced for anger, for guilt, for the complicated combustible mixture of both. What she saw instead looked like a man who had been carrying a door for a very long time and had just been shown where it was supposed to hang. He said, "Your father saved my life." "I know," Clara said. "He shouldn't have been there. It was my mistake that put him in that position. My error in command." He stopped, swallowed. "I've lived with that for a long time." "So have I," she said. The silence between them was the heaviest thing in the room, and also somehow the most honest thing that had been in that room since Clara had arrived at this ranch. "I'm not going to tell you it's all right," Clara said finally, "but I'm going to tell you that my father never blamed you. He wrote to me 2 weeks before he died. He said you were a good officer in an impossible situation. Those were his words." She looked at the saddle. "He kept your life above his because that's who he was, not because you ordered him to, because he chose to." Nate did not say anything for a long time. When he did speak, his voice was different, stripped of the particular control that Clara had come to recognize as his default register, quieter and rougher underneath. "I'll have a lock put on this door tonight," he said. "And I'll be having a longer conversation with Silas Boone first thing in the morning." He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the bench. "Your father's saddle isn't going anywhere, and neither as long as you want to stay, are you?" He left. Clara sat down on the edge of the cot and looked at the cavalry saddle on its peg, and for the first time since she'd carried it out of a dead man's house and thrown it over her shoulder and walked west with nothing else to her name. It felt less like something she was dragging and more like something that had found finally the place it had always been heading toward. Outside the ranch settled into evening, and 2 weeks ahead of them was a government inspector and a foreman who was running out of time, and Clara Whitmore was still here, still standing, still calculating. And somewhere out in the bunkhouse, Garrett was breathing. Still breathing. Nate Mercer found Silas Boone at the breakfast table the next morning eating like a man with nothing on his conscience and said, "My office, now." Silas wiped his mouth. "I'm not done eating." "Yes, you are," Nate said. The office was a small room off the main hall. Books on one wall, maps on the other, a desk that had seen more hard conversations than any piece of furniture deserved. Nate shut the door. He did not sit down. He put his hands on the desk and looked at Silas standing in the middle of the room and said, "Garrett said your name." "Garrett's half dead and running a fever," Silas said immediately. "Anything out of his mouth. Is still his mouth saying it?" Nate kept his voice level. "A man I've had on this payroll for 8 months, who you personally vouched for, who you personally assigned to the one-night watch that happened to be the night our 3 most valuable horses were stolen. And the man from Laramie you had here 3 weeks ago, the one you called an old friend. Where is he now?" Silas crossed his arms. "I don't know what you're—" "Don't." Nate said it so quietly it was almost soft. "Don't insult either one of us by finishing that sentence. I've been watching you operate for 6 years. I know how you move. I know how you prepare. Whatever you were building here, Silas, it's done. I want you gone from this property by Sunday." Silas looked at him for a long moment. And then something happened in his expression that Nate hadn't seen before in 6 years, a kind of settling like a man who'd been waiting to put something down and had finally decided this was the place. "Sunday," he said. "All right." He nodded slowly. "But you should know something before Sunday, Nate. About the woman you just decided to believe over me." "I don't need—" "Clara Whitmore's father was Elias Whitmore," Silas said. "3rd Cavalry Sergeant. Died under your command on a mission you called. A mission you've never publicly explained." The room went very still. "I've known for a week," Silas said. "Check the 3rd Cavalry records through a contact in Cheyenne. Your dead sergeant's daughter showing up at your ranch with his saddle calling herself a widow." He spread his hands. "Now, you can fire me Sunday, Nate, but come Friday when that inspector arrives, I'm going to be standing in front of him and every hand on this property, and I'm going to tell that story. And everyone is going to decide for themselves whether the woman who trained those horses did it out of skill or out of a plan to get close to the man who got her father killed." Nate said nothing. "Because that's what it looks like from the outside," Silas said pleasantly. "And outside is where the inspector lives." He left the office without being dismissed, and Nate stood at his desk with his hands flat on the wood and breathed through it. The anger, and behind the anger the old guilt, and behind the guilt, the particular helplessness of a man who has built something he cares about and watched someone find the exact right angle to use it against him. He gave himself 60 seconds. Then he went to find Clara. She was at the corral, She was always at the corral. He stood at the fence and said, "Silas knows about your father. He's been sitting on it. He plans to use it at the inspection Friday." Clara didn't stop what she was doing, working Ghost through a slow rein change left to right, steady pressure, the horse following smoothly. But her jaw set in a way Nate had learned to read as the emotional equivalent of bracing for impact. "He plans to say I came here to get close to you," she said, "because of what happened to my father." "Yes." "And that the horse training was a pretense." "Yes." She brought Ghost to a halt, stood quiet for a moment. Then she turned and looked at Nate directly, and her eyes were clear and hard and very tired. "Is that what you think?" Nate looked at her. "I think you came here needing work. I think you knew whose ranch this was before you walked through that gate. And I think you decided to prove yourself anyway, rather than use what you knew." He paused. "I don't think those things are in conflict." Something moved through Clara's expression. "I recognized your name on the posting in Cheyenne," she said. "I won't lie about that. I stood there for a long time before I decided to come." She looked at Ghost, then back at him. "But I came because of the horses, because there was a contract and horses that needed gentling and I could do it. My reasons were practical." Her voice was steady. "Whatever I feel about what happened to my father, I left that outside your gate." Nate nodded once. "Friday," he said. "You need those horses clean and ready. Whatever Silas says, the horses will say more." He turned to go. "Nate." She said it without thinking, and then heard herself use his name the first time without the title and didn't take it back. "What he said about your command decision. The mission that killed my father. I meant what I told you last night. My father's letter said, 'I know what you said.'" He stopped walking, but didn't turn around. Doesn't make it easier to hear it said in public by a man who's going to frame it as ugly as he possibly can. He exhaled slowly. "I'll deal with that when it comes." He walked back to the house, and Clara watched him go, and Ghost pressed her nose into the back of Clara's shoulder, warm and steady, and Clara stood there a moment and let the weight of the next 4 days settle into her bones where she'd have to carry it. Then she picked up the reins and went back to work. Caleb appeared at her elbow at mid-morning, with the expression he'd been wearing since the rustler conversation, half frightened, half resolved, like someone standing at the edge of something they'd decided to jump off of. "Henderson and Briggs are talking," he said quietly. "Silas got to them last night. Told them Clara Whitmore's real name is the same as a sergeant who died under Nate's command 6 years back. Told them she's here for revenge. Told them the horse training is cover." He was talking fast, watching the yard over his shoulder. "Henderson believes it. Briggs isn't sure. But they're talking, and the others are listening." Clara kept her eyes on Cannon, who she was working at a slow trot on the lunge line. "How many?" "4 or 5 who are uncertain now. 3 who don't care either way. Decker still hasn't said anything." He paused. "Decker's the one who matters. The others follow him." "I know." She'd read Decker in the first week, quiet, watchful, the kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself. "What does Decker say when they talk to him?" "He says he's watching the horses," Caleb said. "He says horses don't lie." Clara almost smiled. "Smart man. He's been here 20 years. Caleb picked at the fence rail. "Mrs. Whitmore, the buckle. I've been thinking if that man from Laramie is connected to Silas, and Silas is connected to whoever wanted to buy those horses, there's a buyer somewhere. Someone paid for a specific job on specific animals. That's not random." He looked at her. "Someone wanted the contract broken, not just the horses stolen, the contract itself destroyed. Which means someone else wants that government contract." Clara stopped the lunge line, stood very still. "What other ranch," she said slowly, "is close enough to Cheyenne to pick up a remount contract if Mercer Creek falls through?" "Hendrick's outfit," Caleb said. 8 miles south. Maxwell Hendrick. He bid against Nate for this contract and lost. He said it with the careful tone of someone putting pieces together that have been sitting in front of him for a while. He lost because Nate's horses were rated higher, or they were supposed to be. Clara looked at Cannon moving smooth and easy on the lunge. "If those 3 horses hadn't come back," she said, "and Nate missed the inspection deadline." "Hendrick would be the next man up," Caleb said. "Automatic. That's how the contracts work." A silence. "Get Ruth," Clara said. "Tell her to find out if Silas has any correspondence. She's seen letters, telegrams, anything that came in from south of the ranch in the last 2 months. Don't tell her why yet. Just ask her to think about it." "She's already thinking about it," Caleb said. "Ruth thinks about everything." Garrett woke up on Thursday. Not fully, not the talking sitting up kind of awake, but the in and out kind where a person surfaces for a few minutes and then goes back under. Ruth was with him when it happened. She sent for Nate. He came to the bunkhouse with Clara, who had been in the yard when the word reached her, and they stood on either side of Garrett's bunk while he swam up through the pain and the fever and tried to find them. "Garrett," Nate said. "Can you hear me?" Garrett's eyes moved, found Nate's face. "Who did this to you?" Garrett's lips moved, the same word as before, the one he'd said in his first moments of consciousness, the one that had made Silas's face go still. But there was more now. He was trying to say more. His hand moved on the blanket fingers, curling and uncurling. Ruth held out a pencil. She'd thought of it before any of them. She put it between his fingers, held a page from the bunkhouse log beneath his hand. Garrett's hand moved. What he wrote was barely legible, 3 lines of shaking fever-weak letters, but Ruth was good at reading things that didn't want to be read, and she held the page up to the light and read aloud quietly and steadily what it said. "Silas, Hendrick. Man from Laramie, name of Cole. Paid $50 to take the 3 horses to Hendrick's south pasture. I was supposed to not show for the watch. I didn't know they'd—" The writing broke off. Then underneath one more line. "I'm sorry. Tell Mercer I'm sorry." The bunkhouse was very quiet. Nate took the paper, read it himself. His jaw was working. "That's enough to take to the sheriff," Clara said. "It's a sick man's handwriting," Nate said. "Silas will say it was written under duress, or that Garrett's out of his mind with fever. We need Cole." He folded the paper carefully, like it was something valuable. "The man from Laramie. We need Cole." "He ran from the canyon," Clara said. "But he left this ranch on a horse. Horses have to eat and water. He's not far." "If he went to Hendrick's, then Hendrick has a problem," Clara said. "Because if Cole is on Hendrick's property, and the sheriff shows up with a statement from Garrett, Hendrick's involvement in tampering with a government contract isn't just a business matter anymore." She met Nate's eyes. "Send the sheriff to Hendrick's tonight, not tomorrow. Tonight before Silas finds a way to warn him." Nate looked at her for a moment. Then he folded Garrett's statement into his breast pocket and walked out without another word, moving with the particular purposeful quiet of a man who had run out of patience for being careful. Silas, crossing the yard with a coil of rope over one shoulder, saw Nate's face and stopped, said nothing. Watched him saddle his horse and ride out toward town. Then Silas turned and his eyes moved across the yard until they found Clara standing in the bunkhouse doorway. He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had nothing warm in it. Chicken. The inspector arrived a day early. Not Friday, Thursday evening, just as the sun started laying long shadows across the yard. A buggy, 2 horses, a man in a good coat, who climbed down and introduced himself as Thomas Aldridge, Federal Remount Inspector, and said he hoped he wasn't inconveniencing anyone by coming ahead of schedule. Clara heard it from the corral and felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. She had one more day of work planned. One more session with Ghost on the groundwork that would make the difference between adequate and impressive. One more morning to work, Cannon's lead change on the right rein, which was still slightly sticky. She didn't have one more morning. She had right now. Nate was already moving toward Aldridge, greeting him, doing the thing he did well, projecting calm authority, while everything behind it reorganized at speed. He caught Clara's eye across the yard and gave her the smallest nod. She turned back to the corral. If they were doing this tonight, then tonight it was. She worked Ghost first in the last hour of evening light, running her through everything, the obstacles, the weight shifts, the traffic of other horses moving around her that used to make the mare lock up and now barely registered. Ghost moved like water, like she'd been born knowing this work and had simply needed someone to remind her. Then Cannon. His lead change was still slightly off on the right, but Clara had an idea she'd been saving it. She moved the transition point earlier, gave Cannon more room on the approach, let him find the change instead of pushing him to it. On the third try, he nailed it clean and balanced like a clock ticking over to the right hour. When she brought them in and took the saddle off, Ghost Aldridge was standing at the corral fence, watching. He said, "How long have you been working these three?" 2 weeks, Clara said. A pause. "These were the horses that were reported stolen 6 nights ago." "Yes, sir. I recovered them." Aldridge looked at her with the steady, evaluating expression of a man who dealt in measurable things and had learned to be skeptical of whatever didn't measure clearly. "You? Alone?" "Yes, sir." "And you're the trainer?" "Yes, sir." He was quiet for a moment. "In the morning," he said, "I'll want to see all 3 under saddle. Full working evaluation." "They'll be ready," Clara said. He went back to the house for supper, and Clara stood in the quiet of the stable, with her hand on Ghost's neck, and she breathed in, and she breathed out, and she told herself she had done everything she could do with 2 weeks and an ankle that still wasn't right, and a foreman working against her, and everything else. She had done everything she could do. Morning would tell the rest. Morning came cold and bright, the kind of Wyoming summer morning that felt like an apology for the heat, and it brought Silas Boone in from wherever he'd been since Nate had ridden to town and back the night before. He came into the yard at 7 o'clock, just as Caleb was helping Clara saddle Dominion for the first demonstration, and he had a man with him, a stranger. Well-dressed, soft-handed, the kind of man who rode in buggies rather than on horseback. Clara clocked him in 3 seconds and didn't know him, and that was the problem because she should have. In a spread this size, a visitor this early on inspection day should have been expected. Nate came off the porch at the sight of Silas. "You're supposed to be off this property by Sunday." "I'm still your foreman until Sunday," Silas said pleasantly. "And this is Mr. Aldridge, the brother, not the inspector. He's an attorney. He represents Maxwell Hendrick." The yard went very still. Nate looked at the attorney. The attorney opened a leather case and produced a document papers, several pages neatly folded. "My client, Mr. Maxwell Hendrick, is filing a formal complaint with the Federal Remount Office regarding the circumstances of the Mercer Creek contract application," he said in the efficient, uninflected tone of a man paid by the word to make things sound procedural. Specifically, he alleges that Mr. Mercer misrepresented the training status of the 3 horses in question, and that the horse's current condition does not meet federal standards. He is requesting that the inspection today be suspended pending review. "He can request anything he wants," Nate said. "The inspector is here, the horses are here, the inspection happens." The complaint also raises questions about the qualifications of the individual responsible for the horse's preparation. The attorney looked at Clara without particular malice, just professional detachment, the instrument of someone else's intention. Specifically, it alleges that the trainer identified as 1, Clara Whitmore misrepresented her credentials and her identity to obtain employment at this ranch, and that her presence here constitutes a conflict of interest given her personal connection to the ranch owner. "What personal connection?" Aldridge, the inspector, said from the porch where he'd come to stand with his coffee. Silas stepped forward. Not the attorney, now Silas himself, with the practiced ease of a man who had rehearsed this. Clara Whitmore's father was Sergeant Elias Whitmore of the 3rd Cavalry. He said loud enough for the yard, and there was most of the yard now, all the hands, everyone who had heard movement and come to see. He died under Nathan Mercer's command 6 years ago in a mission that ended badly. She came to this ranch with her father's cavalry saddle and lied about who she was and lied about where the saddle came from. He paused for effect. "She's not here as a horse trainer. She's here because the man who got her father killed owns this ranch. The yard was silent. Clara stood beside Dominion, with one hand on the horse's neck, and said nothing. She let the silence happen. She let it be exactly as long as it needed to be. Then Decker, from his place near the stable wall, 20 years on this ranch, never the first to speak, never the last to be heard, said in his quiet, deliberate way, "I've watched that woman work those horses every morning for 2 weeks. Whatever her reasons for coming, the work she did is the work she did. I don't see how one cancels the other." One of the younger hands, a man named Price, said, "She brought back 3 horses alone in the dark, came back beat up and still leading them." "What's the story on that?" "Silas?" Silas's jaw tightened. "That's not the point being." "Seems like the point to me," Price said. "Me too," said Caleb from where he was standing near Dominion's head, 16 years old, and shaking slightly, but not backing up. Silas looked at Nate. "You going to let your men make a mockery of—" "My men are asking questions," Nate said. "Good questions." He stepped forward into the space between Silas and the attorney and Clara. "You want to talk about Elias Whitmore? All right. Let's talk about him." His voice was steady, and it was also the kind of voice that comes from someone who has made a decision they won't be walking back from. Elias Whitmore was the finest cavalry horse sergeant I ever commanded. He died because I made an error in judgment during a field operation in June of 1867. I made the wrong call on the terrain. Sergeant Whitmore corrected my mistake, and it cost him his life. He looked at the yard, at the gathered men, at Aldridge, the inspector, on the porch. "I have lived with that for 6 years. I will live with it for the rest of my life, and I have never once spoken about it publicly because I didn't know how." He turned and looked at Clara. "His daughter walked onto this ranch 2 weeks ago and trained 3 horses better than any man I've hired in 6 years. She didn't ask for acknowledgement for what her father did. She didn't ask for anything except a fair chance at the work." He looked back at the crowd. "I don't know how to call that a conflict of interest. I call it the most honest thing that's happened on this property in a long time." Silas said, "This is very touching, Nate. It doesn't change what she—" "Silas." Clara spoke for the first time, and something in her voice pulled the yard quiet, the way a hand on a horse's nose pulls it quiet. Not forceful, just present and certain. She looked at him directly. "I have something that belongs to you. Or rather, that belongs to a man you paid." She looked at Caleb. Caleb reached into his jacket pocket and held out the belt buckle. Clara took it and held it up. "This came off the man I fought in the canyon. The bigger one. The one who ran when I took the reins back." She looked at Silas. "You had a man here from Laramie 3 weeks ago, a man named Cole, according to Garrett's written statement, which Nate took to the sheriff last night." She watched Silas's face change. "The sheriff rode to Maxwell Hendrick's property last night. The man named Cole was found in Hendrick's bunkhouse." She held the buckle steady. "This buckle matches the one Cole wore in the description given by 2 of our hands who saw him here." She looked at Aldridge, the inspector, who had come down from the porch and was standing in the yard with his coffee cup in one hand and the particular expression of a federal official who was reassessing his morning. "Those horses were stolen to destroy this ranch's ability to meet the contract deadline. The theft was arranged by this ranch's foreman, paid for by Maxwell Hendrick, and executed by Cole and one other man." She lowered her hand. "I'd like to show you what those horses can do now, Mr. Aldridge, and then you can decide what that's worth." The yard was very quiet. Silas opened his mouth. Then he looked at Nate, at the gathered hands, at Decker, who was looking at him with 20 years of quiet, accumulated knowing, at Caleb, who was looking at him with something simpler, a 16-year-old boy who had decided to be brave. He closed his mouth. The attorney was already putting his papers back in his case, in the careful way of a professional who can read a room and knows when his client has just become a significant problem rather than a profitable one. "Mr. Boone," Aldridge said, "I'd appreciate it if you remained available this morning. I'm going to have some questions." Silas said nothing. He stood very still, and the thing that had always animated him, the certainty, the weight of himself, The absolute confidence that he was the most important presence in any space he occupied seemed to leak out of him in the space of 30 seconds, and what was left was something smaller and harder and much more frightened. He didn't run. Men like Silas never ran when they were watched. But he stepped back from the center of the yard, and he stayed back, and he did not speak again. The inspection took 3 hours. Aldridge was thorough. He watched Dominion at the walk, trot, and canter. He watched Ghost's obstacle work, and her response to simulated battle noise, the crack of a board, a sudden shout, a flag waved at the edge of the corral. He watched Cannon's lead changes, and his carrying work, and his ground manners, when 3 men moved around him at once. Clara rode all 3. Her ankle burned. She didn't show it. Nate stood at the fence for all 3 hours. He didn't say anything. He watched Clara work the horses the way she realized at some point during the second hour. He had been watching her work them since the very first day, with that complete focused attention that she had first read as scrutiny, and was now reading as something else. After the 3rd horse, Aldridge made notes in his ledger. Deliberate, unhurried. The kind of notes a man made when he was being careful to get them right. Then he looked at Nate. "These are exceptional animals," he said. "The mare in particular. 6 weeks ago, according to your initial report, she was barely manageable." He glanced at Clara. "What was your method?" "I listened to her," Clara said. "She had specific fears from a specific incident. I worked around them until she could manage them herself." She paused. "The horse has to trust you before she can trust the situation. That's the order it goes in." Aldridge wrote something else. Then he said, "I understand there was a formal complaint filed this morning on behalf of a competing bidder." "There was," Nate said. "Given the circumstances, you've described the theft, the subsequent recovery, and the written statement now in the sheriff's possession, I'm going to recommend that complaint be set aside pending the investigation of the Hendrick matter." Aldridge closed his ledger. "I'm also going to recommend that this contract be confirmed at the full rate." He said it without ceremony, the way professionals delivered good news, factually leaving the feeling of it for everyone else to handle. Caleb made a sound like a man who'd been holding his breath for a week. Decker from the fence said, in a way that sounded like satisfaction. Ruth, who had appeared at the edge of the yard somewhere in the second hour, and been there ever since with her arms folded, and her expression unreadable, let out a slow breath and went back to the house. Nate shook Aldridge's hand, said the appropriate things, walked the man through the paperwork. Did all of it with the contained steadiness that was his particular gift. It wasn't until Aldridge's buggy was pulling out of the gate that Clara saw it a brief private thing, not for the yard. Nate standing at the fence post, with one hand on the rail, his head down for just a moment, and the exhale that came out of him was the kind that a man only lets out when he believes finally that he can. She looked away, gave him the privacy of it. Then she went to put the horses up. The sheriff rode in at 2 p.m. with Cole in custody. It wasn't a dramatic arrival, just a man on horseback and a man in handcuffs. The particular mundane machinery of consequence finally catching up to its cause. Cole was brought into the yard, and Silas was called out of the bunkhouse where he'd been sitting since the inspection, and the look that passed between them when Cole was walked past told the sheriff everything he needed, and Clara, watching from the stable doorway, everything she'd suspected. Silas was taken in for formal questioning. Not under arrest, not yet. Not without the full weight of what Garrett had written being processed through the proper channels. But taken, and that was enough for now. He passed Clara on the way to the sheriff's horse and stopped just for a moment, just long enough to look at her with the particular combination of rage and calculation that she had been reading in him for 2 weeks. She held his gaze and didn't move. He said very quietly, "You think you won something today." "I think your men's wages are safe for another year," Clara said. "I think 3 horses that could have ended up in Hendrick's pasture are standing in that stable. And I think Garrett is alive." She met his eyes. "I didn't come here to win something. I came here to do a job. The difference matters." Silas looked at her a moment longer. Then the sheriff's hand closed on his arm, firm and impersonal, and he was walked out of the gate. Clara watched until he was gone. Then she leaned her back against the stable wall and tilted her face up and let herself feel it, just for a moment. Just for the 60 seconds the yard happened to be empty around her. Just long enough to be honest with herself about how frightened she had been, how close everything had run, how many points at which it could have broken differently. Her ankle throbbed. Her hands were shaking slightly now that she'd stopped making them hold still. Her eyes still ached where the rustler had hit her 6 nights ago. She had been here 2 weeks and 3 days. It felt like a different lifetime. When she straightened up and looked across the yard, Nate was standing 20 feet away, watching her with the same expression he'd worn at the fence during the inspection, that complete, unhurried attention that had nothing in it of the assessment he'd been making at the beginning, and everything in it of something that had no category yet that he hadn't named, and she hadn't let herself name either. He walked toward her and stopped close, looked at her face, the healing eye, the set of her jaw, the particular quality of exhaustion that comes not from the body giving out, but from the mind finally being allowed to. "You need to sit down," he said. "I'm fine." Clara. Just her name. Quiet and direct, the way he said everything. "You need to sit down." She sat down, on the same overturned bucket she'd been sitting on since her 3rd day outside Dominion's stall, and Nate sat on the straw bale across from her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then he said, "I'm going to say something, and I want you to let me finish before you tell me why it's not necessary." "All right. What you did for this ranch recovering those horses, training them, standing up in that yard this morning, I can't repay that in wages," he said. "But I'm going to try because it's the right thing to do, and because I have not always done right by the people who deserved it." He looked at his hands briefly. "And I'm going to say what I should have said the day you walked through that gate, that Elias Whitmore's daughter deserved a job here before she'd proven a single thing. Because he was a man worth honoring, and honoring him means treating the people he loved with the same respect I owed him." Clara's throat tightened. She didn't trust her voice for a moment. When she found it, she said, "He would have liked you. He did like you. He wrote that in his letter." She looked at the stable wall. "He said you were hard on yourself and easy on your men, and that those 2 things were the right way around for a person in command." She paused. "I think he was right." Nate was quiet for a moment. Then, "Stay on," he said. "Officially, head horse trainer. Full wage, proper contract name on the payroll." Clara looked at him. "Not because of your father," he said. "Because of what I watched you do for 2 weeks with the most difficult horses on this property and the most difficult foreman in Wyoming working against you." He held her gaze. "Because this ranch is better with you in it. And I don't want to spend the next 6 years regretting not saying that clearly when I had the chance." Outside in the yard she could hear Caleb's voice, something happy in it, lighter than she'd heard it, and then Decker answering, and the sound of other men finding their way back to ordinary work, now that the long pressure of the last week had finally lifted. Clara looked at the cavalry saddle hanging on its peg inside the stable door, visible from where she sat. Her father's saddle. Elias Whitmore's saddle. The weight she'd carried across half of Wyoming, and into this yard, and through everything that had come after. It hung still and steady on its peg, and in the golden afternoon it looked less like something carried, and more like something placed, like something that had arrived where it was supposed to go. "Yes," she said, just the one word, but Nate Mercer heard everything in it. The morning after felt nothing like victory. That was the thing nobody told you about the end of a hard fight, that the morning after was its own kind of hard. Quiet and strange, with all the noise gone, and nothing left but the work that still had to be done, and the people who were still there, and the question of what you did with all of it. Clara was at the corral at first light, the same as always. Caleb came out 20 minutes later and stood at the fence with 2 cups of coffee and handed one over without a word, which was the most useful thing anyone had done for her in 48 hours. She took it and drank it, and they stood together watching Ghost move freely around the corral. No saddle, no lead. just the horse doing what the horse wanted, which was more than a lot of creatures in this world ever got to do. Henderson left, Caleb said. Clara nodded. She had expected it. Henderson had been Silas's man in spirit long before he was Silas's man in any formal sense, the kind of person who needed the authority of the loudest voice in the room to know which direction to face. "Briggs?" she asked. "Still here. Helped Decker with the south water line this morning without being asked." Caleb wrapped both hands around his cup. "I think that means something." "It does," Clara said. "Price said he's staying specifically because he wants to learn horsework." He paused. "I told him you'd teach him if he kept his opinions to himself and did what he was told." "You shouldn't have promised that without asking me," Clara said. Caleb went red. "I know, I'm sorry, I would have said yes," she said. "Ask first next time." He exhaled, nodded. "Yes, ma'am." It was the first time he'd said that to her, and they both noticed it, and neither of them made anything of it, which was exactly right. Garrett could sit up by Thursday, not comfortably. 3 cracked ribs and a broken arm made comfort a distant aspiration. But he was upright and lucid, and could speak in full sentences, which was enough for the sheriff to come back out and take a proper statement. Clara was not in the room for that. Ruth was, because Ruth had been in and out of that bunkhouse every day since Garrett came back on Aldous Greer's wagon and had assumed a quiet authority over his recovery that nobody had thought to question. She came out afterward and found Clara in the tack room and said, "He told them everything. The arrangement with Silas, the money that changed hands, the communication through Cole. All of it." She sat down on the bench and folded her hands. "He also told them something else." Clara looked up from the bridle she was conditioning. "Silas has been in communication with Hendrick for 2 years, Ruth said. "Not just the horses, the whole operation. Feed contracts, equipment purchases. Silas was redirecting money from Nate's suppliers to Hendrick's accounts on a percentage arrangement. Skimming." She paused. 2 years, Clara. The numbers the sheriff is working with are significant." Clara set the bridle down. "How significant?" "Enough that Nate's account at the Cheyenne Bank is considerably lighter than he believed it to be," Ruth said carefully. "The contract saves the ranch. But the contract money coming in is going to land in a hole Silas spent 2 years digging." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Does Nate know?" "The sheriff is with him now." She was already on her feet. She didn't go in. She waited on the porch until the sheriff came out, a methodical man named Beaumont, who had the particular quality of a person who dealt with bad news so regularly that it had stopped changing his expression, and when he nodded at her on his way to his horse, she went inside. Nate was standing at his office desk with his back to the door, one hand on the edge of the wood, looking at papers that Clara suspected he wasn't actually seeing. "How bad?" she said. "Bad enough," he said without turning. "The contract covers operations for the year. There's nothing left in reserve. If anything goes wrong between now and next spring, a hard winter, a disease moving through the herd, a fence line that needs replacing, there's no cushion." He turned then. His face was doing the controlled thing, but she could see the edges of it, the particular strain of a man who had worked for something for a long time, and was calculating whether it could survive another blow. "I put this ranch together over 12 years. I knew every number in those accounts. I thought I knew every number." "You trusted your foreman with the accounts," Clara said. "Same as you trusted him with the horses. Same mistake twice." "Different face on the same mistake," Clara said. "That happens to careful people too." She sat down across from his desk without being invited, which she had learned was sometimes the only way to have a real conversation with him, take the informality he wouldn't take himself. "What do you need?" He looked at her. "I'm sorry. Practically. What do you need?" "Not what's wrong." "I heard what's wrong. What do you need to fix it?" She looked at the papers on his desk. "The feed contracts Silas rerouted, are they recoverable if you contact the original suppliers directly?" Nate blinked. Then slowly he sat down. "Possibly, some of them. The equipment purchases, A few could be reversed if Hendrik hasn't taken delivery. And the contract payment from the remount office, when does that land? 6 weeks. So you have 6 weeks to tighten everything down. She looked at him. That's manageable. It's not comfortable, but it's manageable. She paused. You also have 12 men who just watched you stand up in that yard and tell the truth about something you've carried for 6 years, and then watched you back a woman none of them knew over a foreman they'd worked with for years. Men respect that kind of thing. She met his eyes. Ask them. They'll work lean for a season if they know why. People will do a great deal when they're told the truth. Nate looked at her for a long moment. Not the measuring look, not the assessing look, but the other one. The one she still didn't have a clean word for. You're very practical, he said. My father raised me to be. He raised you to be a great many things, Nate said quietly. Something moved through the room. Not uncomfortable, more like a door opening onto a space that had been closed for a long time and needed the air. He used to say, Clara said that the most dangerous thing a person could do was believe they were past needing help. That the ones who thought they didn't need anybody were just the ones who hadn't hit the right trouble yet. She looked at her hands. He asked for help when he needed it. He was never ashamed of that. Nate picked up the papers on his desk and began organizing them into something that made sense, not frantically, with the deliberate, methodical attention of a man who had decided to deal with what was in front of him instead of what might be behind him. I'll meet with the men tonight, he said. Tell them what happened. What we're looking at. He paused. And I'll need to spend some time this week going through every account Silas touched. I can help with that, Clara said. He looked up. You know accounting. My husband was a bookkeeper, she said. I learned enough to be useful. She stood. Which is what I'm here for. She left the office, and behind her she heard him exhale slow and long, the kind of breath that comes out of someone who has just put something down. The meeting that evening was the most honest hour Mercer Creek Ranch had seen in years. Nate laid it out without softening what Silas had done, what it had cost, what the next 6 months would look like. Reduced supply orders, delayed equipment repairs, everyone working a leaner operation until the contract payment cleared and the financial ground was level again. He didn't apologize for the situation. He explained it. And then he asked directly, looking around at the assembled men, who was staying and who wasn't. And he said he wanted the answer from each man himself, not overheard secondhand. Every man in the room said he was staying. Even Briggs, who had been the most uncertain, who had stood in the yard listening to Silas's accusation about Clara, with the look of a man genuinely unsure which way the truth was pointing, raised his hand and said, I'm staying. And I'm sorry I let that man put doubts in my head that weren't earned. He was looking at Clara when he said it. Clara nodded once. That was enough. After the meeting, Decker came up to her in the yard. He was a man of very few words on his best days, and he used approximately 3 of them now. He stopped in front of her, looked at her steadily, and touched the brim of his hat. It was the kind of gesture that carried more weight than a speech. Clara said, Thank you, Decker. He said, Good work on those horses, ma'am, and walked away. And that was the end of the conversation, and also, in its way, the end of the question of whether Clara Whitmore belonged at Mercer Creek Ranch. The twist came from the sheriff 2 days later, and it was the kind that changed the shape of everything retrospectively, the kind that made you look back at what had already happened and see it differently. Beaumont rode in mid-morning and found Nate and Clara both in the training corral with a new horse, a difficult roan gelding that had arrived from a neighboring spread and needed assessment before anyone decided what to do with him. The sheriff waited at the fence with the patience of his profession, and when they came out, he said, Hendrik's attorney came to my office yesterday evening. And, Nate said, and Maxwell Hendrik wants to make a deal. Beaumont pulled a folded document from his coat. He's offering to return 2 years of fraudulently redirected payments, full amount, verified through the supplier records, in exchange for reduced charges on the conspiracy count. He looked at Nate. Silas is not going to be offered the same arrangement. Silas organized it. Hendrik was a participant. He paused. The amount Hendrik is prepared to return Mr. Mercer is considerably more than what I think you realized you'd lost. He handed over the document. Nate opened it, read it, and the expression on his face was the one she'd never seen there before, not the controlled version of something, but the thing itself. Genuine, uncomplicated relief. He handed it to Clara. She read the number, looked up. That's 2 full seasons of operating costs. Yes, Beaumont said. I believe it is. He put his hat back on. Silas is looking at federal charges for the contract interference. That's out of my jurisdiction now. The remount office filed their own complaint the morning after the inspection. He nodded at both of them. Thought you'd want to know where things stood. He rode out. Clara stood in the yard, holding the document with the number that meant the ranch was not just surviving, but recovering further and faster than anything the last week had suggested was possible. She felt something that took her a moment to identify because it was unfamiliar in its specific combination relief, and something that lived next to gratitude, which was the feeling of realizing that the thing you'd been afraid would break had turned out to be stronger than the weight that hit it. Nate was looking at her. Stop looking at me like that, she said. Like what? Like I did something. You went into a dark canyon alone and came back with 3 horses, he said. Everything after that started there. You're the one who stood up in that yard and told the truth in front of everyone, she said. Don't give me credit for that. All right, he said. We both did things. Yes, she said. We did. A pause, the kind that had been occurring more frequently in their conversations lately, weighted and aware, occupying the space between what was said and what both of them were not quite saying yet. Nate broke it by saying practically, I'll have Ruth prepare the guest room properly. You shouldn't be sleeping near the wash house anymore. Clara looked at him. I'm fine where I am. The head trainer doesn't sleep near the wash house, he said. She has appropriate accommodations. You're being formal about it because otherwise it sounds like something else, Clara said. Nate said nothing for a moment. Then he said, yes, that's accurate. Another pause. I'll move my things this evening, Clara said. Thank you. J. Garrett was well enough to sit outside in the afternoon sun by the end of the week. Clara brought him coffee. She'd started doing it 3 days ago, without announcing it, just leaving it on the crate beside his chair, the same way Nate had once left coffee outside her door, and sat nearby with the bridle she was always repairing, or the rope she was always working on, because being near someone who needed steadiness was easier when your hands were busy. I should have said something sooner, Garrett said one afternoon. He was looking at his wrapped arm. I knew what Silas was doing. I knew for months. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I needed the wage and Silas was family and... He stopped. I kept telling myself that right up until the night they left me in that canyon, and I understood real clear that I was an inconvenience, not family. Never was. You said something when it mattered, Clara said. After it almost killed people. Still, she said, you said it. She kept her hands on the rope. That takes something. Garrett looked at her sideways. You're being generous. I'm being accurate, she said. Generous would be pretending it wasn't close. He almost smiled. You sound like your father. Clara's hands stilled. I met him once, Garrett said. In Denver. I'd done a season with the 3rd before I came west for ranch work. Sergeant Whitmore he wasn't a loud man, but when he talked the horses listened, and the men listened because the horses did. He paused. I didn't put it together who you were until after. I'm sorry I didn't. Don't, Clara said. You didn't owe me anything about my father. You didn't even know I was his daughter. I know now, Garrett said. And I'm saying it now. He was a good man, Mrs. Whitmore. One of the best I ever saw in that uniform. He looked at his arm again. He'd be proud of you. The way you went after those horses. The way you stood up in that yard. He'd be proud. Clara looked at the rope in her hands and did not trust her voice for a moment. When she found it, she said, He always said that the best thing you could do with what someone taught you was use it. She paused. I'm trying.
Banate.
The evening that changed things, not dramatically, not with any of the noise that the week before had been full of, was a Thursday. The hands had eaten. The horses were settled. The accounts which Clara and Nate had spent 3 evenings going through together at the office desk were organized into something honest and manageable. The Hendrick payment had been formally confirmed. The remount contract was signed and filed. Clara was sitting on the porch when Nate came out and leaned on the rail beside her. They sat in the quiet for a while. The summer dark was warm and full of the sounds of a working ranch at rest. Then Nate said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask?" "When you stood in Cheyenne reading that posting," he said, "knowing whose ranch it was, knowing what it meant, what made you decide to come anyway?" Clara thought about it honestly, the way she'd been trying to think about things lately, without the armor of practical justification, without the habit of making everything about the work and nothing about the rest. "I'd been carrying that saddle for 3 years," she said. "And I was tired. Not of the work. I've never been tired of the work, but tired of carrying something alone that was meant to go somewhere." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I think I knew some part of me that this was where it was supposed to go. That he belonged here in some way, his memory, what he did, the thing that happened between him and you. I don't know that I was brave about it. I think I was just more tired of carrying it than I was afraid of what I'd find." Nate was quiet. Then, "I'm glad you weren't more afraid." "So am I," she said. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I need you to hear it without making it practical, because you have a tendency to make things practical when they make you uncomfortable." Clara said, "I heard that. You did the same thing just now. When I asked why you came, you gave me the answer about the saddle. That's true, but it's not all of it." She looked at him. "Is it?" he said. Not a challenge, just a question. She held his gaze for a long moment. Nate Mercer, who was hard on himself and easy on his men, and who left coffee outside doors and took the weight of other people's grief and carried his own like something he'd accepted as permanent furniture. Who had stood in that yard and said the hardest true thing in front of everyone because it was right. Who looked at her had looked at her. She understood now for 3 weeks, like someone who was seeing what was actually there rather than what he expected. "No," she said. "It's not all of it." He nodded, slowly. "I'm not going to be rushed about the rest of it," she said. "I want to say that clearly." "I know," he said. "I'm not rushing. I have spent 2 years being very careful about what I let myself want," she said. "I need you to understand that the pace of this is mine." Clara, quiet. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked out at this dark prairie, wide and warm and full of space, and she felt something that she had not let herself feel in a very long time. Not the relief of the contract or the exhaustion after the fight, or the practical satisfaction of a problem solved. Something simpler. Something that had to do with being exactly where she was with the person beside her and not being afraid of it. "All right," she said. They sat together on the porch in the summer dark, and neither of them spoke for a long time, and the quiet between them was entirely different from the quiet of 2 weeks ago. Not the silence of 2 people being careful, but the silence of 2 people who had stopped needing to be. Ruth watched them from the kitchen window, as she had been watching most things for 30 years, and said nothing, and allowed herself one small, satisfied expression before she went back to her work. Inside the house, on the wall of Nate's office, a copy of the signed remount contract hung level and straight beside a list of the 12 men who had said yes when he asked who was staying. The list had no gaps and no hesitations. In the tack room, 2 saddles hung side by side on their pegs. Nate's old cavalry gear, worn and well kept, and beside it, the 3rd Cavalry saddle with the dented pommel and the stamp of Elias Whitmore's long service pressed into its leather. Close enough to touch, exactly where they belonged. And in the far corral, Dominion moved in the dark, not the panicked circuit of a frightened horse, not the pacing of an animal waiting for the next blow, but the slow, unhurried motion of a creature that had learned finally that the world it lived in was not something to survive, just something to live in. 6 weeks after the inspection, Mercer Creek Ranch looked like a different place. Not because anything had been built or torn down or painted over the same fences, the same stable, the same porch, where Nate drank his coffee every morning before the hands arrived. The difference was not in the structure, it was in the sound of it. The way the yard moved. The particular quality of work being done by people who understood what they were doing and why. Clara felt it every morning when she walked to the corral. The ease of it. Not comfortable in the soft sense ranching was never soft, but easy in the way that things become easy when they are finally in their right place. The new horses had arrived 2 weeks after the inspection. 7 of them from a spread south of Laramie that had dissolved when the owner died without heirs. Rough stock, all of them, with varying degrees of bad history stamped into their behavior like old scars. The sheriff's office had brokered the transfer on behalf of the estate, and Aldridge the inspector had quietly suggested that Mercer Creek Ranch would be the appropriate placement, which was the federal government's way of saying they were watching how things developed with some interest. Clara had stood in the yard when the trailer pulled in and looked at 7 pairs of frightened eyes and said, "All right." Not to anyone in particular, just to the situation. Price was beside her with a lead rope and the expression of a young man trying very hard to look competent. He had been following her around for 3 weeks with questions. Good questions, the kind that came from actually watching rather than just waiting for instruction. She had started answering them at length, which Caleb had told her was the equivalent of being officially enrolled in school. "Start with the gray on the left," she told Price. "She's the least frightened. Bring her out slow, and don't make any sudden moves near her hindquarters. She's been hit from behind." "How do you know?" "The way she loads her weight forward when she hears something unexpected," Clara said. "She's already moving away from a blow that hasn't happened yet. That's memory, not temperament." She looked at him. "Go slow. If she plants, you plant. Don't pull." Price went. He was slow, and he was careful, and on the third approach, the gray mare followed him out of the trailer on a loose lead, and the expression on Price's face when he turned back to Clara was the same one Caleb had worn the first time he'd done something right with a horse, surprise folding quickly into a kind of quiet pride. Caleb, watching from the fence, said nothing. But he smiled. The letter came on a Tuesday in August. Ruth brought it to the corral mid-morning, which she never did. Ruth delivered things at appropriate times. And mid-morning was not an appropriate time for correspondence unless something required immediate attention. Clara saw her coming and read the urgency in the straightness of Ruth's walk, and she set down what she was doing and met her at the fence. The envelope was official, United States Army letterhead. Addressed to Miss Clara Elias Whitmore, the middle name. Stopping her cold, because nobody here knew her middle name, nobody had asked, and it meant whoever had sent this had done their research carefully. She opened it. She read it once, then again. Then she stood at the corral fence in the summer heat and held the letter with both hands and said nothing for a long time. Ruth waited. "It's a posthumous commendation," Clara said finally. Her voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they are being held very carefully. "For my father. The 3rd Cavalry has formally entered into the record a full account of what happened in June of 1867. The action Sergeant Elias Whitmore took. The lives preserved." She stopped. "They're calling it an act of exceptional valor. There's a medal. They want to know where to send it." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They finally told the truth about it." "Yes." "How long did that take?" 6 years, Clara said. Ruth put one hand briefly on Clara's arm, not a comfort exactly, more a recognition, and then removed it and said, "Nate needs to know about this." "I know. He's been carrying his part of that story for 6 years, too," Ruth said. "Longer than you have in some ways." She paused. "Knowing that the record has been corrected, that it's official now, that matters to a man like him more than you might think." Clara folded the letter carefully, put it in her pocket, looked out at the corral where Price was working the gray mare with the patient, tentative approach of someone learning that patience was a skill, and not just a personality trait. "I know it matters," she said. "That's why I need a minute before I go find him." Ruth nodded and left her to it. Clara stood at the fence and looked at nothing in particular, and let herself feel what the letter meant. Not the public part, not the official record, but the private fact of it that somewhere in a federal file in Washington, the name Elias Whitmore was now attached to the truth of what he had done permanently and irrevocably. That it could not be left out or downgraded or quietly forgotten. That he was in the record as he deserved to be. Her father had never needed the record for himself. He had known what he'd done and why, and had died at peace with it if his letter was honest, and she believed it was. But she had needed it. She hadn't let herself admit that until right now. She took 2 more minutes. Then she went to find Nate. Dad. He read it standing in the doorway of the office, and she watched his face move through things she had no name for. Not grief, because the shape of his grief had changed over the weeks, worn down to something less jagged. Something more like the feeling of setting a heavy object down in a room where it belonged. When he finished, he held the letter at his side and looked at the floor for a moment. They finally put it right, he said. Yes. He looked up. Does that change anything for you about being here? About any of it? Clara looked at him. No, she said. The reasons I'm here now are not the reasons I was afraid of when I came, and they're not the reasons that made me stay. She said it simply because it was simple. I stayed because the work is good, and the horses are real, and the people here are worth staying for. A pause. And because you asked me to. Nate was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed the room and held out the letter, and when she took it, he held on for a second longer than necessary. His hand around hers, around the paper, and then released it. I'd like to request that medal be displayed here, he said. In the tack room, with his saddle. He said it carefully, like a man making an offer he wasn't certain would be accepted. If you think he'd have wanted that, Clara thought about her father. About the kind of man who spent his life in service not for recognition, but because the horses and the soldiers needed someone who understood both. About the letter he'd written 2 weeks before he died, still trying to be useful, still thinking about the people around him. He'd have said it was too much fuss, she said. Probably. But he would have liked it, she said. I think he would have liked knowing that you and I, that things came out right here. She looked at the letter in her hand. Yes, I think he'd have wanted that. The twist came from Aldridge, and it came in person. He rode out on a Friday with a second leather case and the expression of a federal official who has done something he is cautiously pleased about. He found Nate and Clara both in the training corral with 2 of the new horses, and he waited at the fence, and when they came out, he opened the case. The remount office, and he said, has been reviewing the outcomes of this year's contract evaluations. Mercer Creek Ranch produced the highest-rated horses in the Wyoming Territory inspection cycle. He paused. By a significant margin. Another pause. The office is proposing an expanded contract for the next cycle, double the previous number of horses, starting in spring. He held out the document. There is a condition. Nate took the papers, looked at them. What condition? The contract is contingent on the continued employment of the current head trainer, Aldridge said. He looked at Clara. They want your name on the agreement, Mrs. Whitmore, not as a formality, as a requirement. He allowed himself a small, satisfied expression. I may have recommended that specifically. Clara stared at him. The federal government, Aldridge said, does not often move quickly on matters of this kind, but when they do, they tend to mean it. He held out his hand to Clara. Congratulations. Your methods are going to be asked about in offices you've never visited. She shook his hand. Nate was looking at the contract with the expression of a man doing math in his head and arriving repeatedly at a number that was significantly larger than he'd expected. This doubles our operation, he said. At minimum, Aldridge said. We'd need more hands, more stable space. He looked at Clara. More horses in rotation than we've got capacity for right now. We'd need Caleb to take on more responsibility, Clara said. Formally. With appropriate pay. Done. And Price needs to be brought on as a full training assistant. He's ready. Done. And I want input on any new hires who'll be working directly with the horses." Nate looked at her. That was never in question. Aldridge watched this exchange with the quiet attention of a man who had seen a great many ranches, in a great many conditions, and could recognize the particular quality of a place that had found its right configuration. He left an hour later, and Caleb, who had been lurking near the fence since the buggy arrived, and had heard enough to get the general shape of it, came to Clara, and said with barely contained 16-year-old chaos, "Is that true? The federal government asked for you by name?" "It appears so," Clara said. "In writing?" "In writing." He made the sound again, the one from the inspection day, the relief breath of someone who'd been holding on very hard. Then he composed himself and said with enormous formality, "Mrs. Whitmore, I would like to formally request to be considered for a position of increased responsibility within the training program." Clara said, "You've been in that position for 3 weeks, Caleb." "I know," he said. "I just wanted to say it official." She almost laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and it surprised her enough that she put her hand over her mouth, and Caleb grinned in the wide, unself-conscious way of a boy who had learned that making serious people laugh was one of the finer things available to him. The test came from town, as tests in Wyoming Territory tended to. A man named Gerald Foss owned the largest trading post in Callaway and had opinions about most things, and when word reached him that the Mercer Creek contract expansion was specifically tied to a woman trainer, he rode out on a Saturday with his opinions in hand and delivered them to Nate on the porch, while Clara was within clear earshot in the yard. "I'm not saying she doesn't know horses," Foss said at a volume that suggested he didn't particularly care who heard. "I'm saying the federal government tying a military contract to one woman's continued employment is irregular, and irregular means fragile. And I've got 3 men who pull supply routes for your operation, and they want to know if Mercer Creek is a reliable long-term prospect." Nate started to answer. Clara walked up the porch steps. Foss looked at her the way men like Foss look at women who enter conversations they weren't invited into with a particular combination of affront and recalibration. "Mr. Foss," Clara said. "My name is Clara Whitmore. I'm the head trainer whose continued employment concerns you." She stopped at a comfortable distance. "Your supplier's routes are stable. The contract doubles our operation as of spring, which means the supply volume from Callaway increases proportionally. That's good business for your men and for you." She looked at him steadily. "What you're actually asking is whether you should trust a woman to run a horse training program that the federal government has already decided to trust." She paused. "That's a personal question, not a business one. And it has a personal answer, which is that the federal government made that call based on measured results, not preference. The horses either are or aren't ready for military service. These ones were." She held his gaze. "If you'd like to see the inspector's written evaluation, I can get you a copy." Foss looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Nate. Nate said nothing. He was leaning on the porch rail with his coffee and the expression of a man watching a situation handle itself. "I'll take that copy," Foss said finally. Not graciously, but he said it. "I'll have Ruth send it into town," Clara said. "Good day, Mr. Foss." He left. Nate watched him ride out and then looked at Clara, and the thing in his expression was not surprise. He had stopped being surprised by her, she thought, sometime around the 3rd day. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "He came to see you, not me," Clara agreed. But he needed to leave knowing something different than he arrived knowing. It was faster this way. Nate said, "Clara." "Yes. Sit down with me tonight, after supper, on the porch." He said it with the particular careful directness of a man who has decided to stop being careful. Not about the ranch, not about the horses or the contract or any of it. "Just sit with me." She looked at him. "All right," she said. She went back to the yard, and she was aware for the rest of the afternoon of the quality of that "all right," the way it had come out differently than she'd expected, quieter and more certain, like a thing she had decided without needing to deliberate. Supper was ordinary, in the best way. Ruth had made a proper meal, and everyone ate. And Caleb told a story about Price attempting to approach one of the new horses from the wrong angle, and discovering very quickly that horse logic and human logic had significant differences. And even Decker laughed, which was an event significant enough that Price was going to be telling people about it for years. Garrett came to supper for the first time since the canyon. He walked in slowly on his own feet and sat at the end of the table and didn't say much, but ate everything on his plate and accepted second helpings when Ruth offered them. And when supper was done, he looked across the table at Clara and said, "Thank you for the coffee every morning." "It's just coffee," Clara said. "No," Garrett said. "It wasn't." She understood that, so she nodded and let it be what it was. After supper, she went to the tack room. She did this sometimes not to work, just to be in it for a few minutes. The smell of leather and hay, and the particular mineral quality of well-kept metal. The kind of smell that had been the smell of her childhood, her father's world, the one she had learned everything in. The cavalry saddle hung on its peg. Beside it now, carefully mounted and covered with a clean cloth that Clara had placed there herself. The morning after the letter came was a wooden frame waiting. The metal had not arrived yet. These things moved at the speed of federal paperwork, which was to say slowly, but she had prepared the place for it because her father had always said that preparation was a form of belief. You prepared the space for the thing before it arrived because the preparation itself was an act of faith that it would. She put her hand on the saddle the way she always did. The dented pommel. The third cavalry stamp. "We're all right," she said. Quietly to no one in the room. To the person she'd been carrying with her for 3 years. "You would have liked it here. You would have liked him." She paused. "I think you did like him. I think that's why you saved his life." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to stay. I wanted you to know that. I'm going to stay and do the work, and I'm going to do it as myself." She stopped. "Thank you for teaching me how." She took her hand off the saddle. She went to the porch. Nate was already there. 2 cups of coffee. He'd learned her preferences the way she'd learned the sound of his boots on the porch boards by paying attention over time. They sat in the warm Wyoming dark, and he said, "I want to say something that I haven't said in the right words yet." "Say it," she said. "I spent 6 years making decisions about what I owed Elias Whitmore's memory," he said. "Feeling his death like a debt I couldn't pay. Letting it make me careful and closed and smaller than I should have been." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "You came here and changed that. Not by forgiving me, I don't think that was yours to give or mine to ask for, but by living the way you live, by doing what you do without asking permission and without being ashamed of what you needed." He paused. "You taught me something about how to carry things. The difference between carrying something like a burden and carrying it like inheritance." He looked at her. "Your father's saddle, the way you talk about him, the way you use what he taught you not as weight but as foundation." Another pause longer. "I want to learn to carry things that way." Clara looked at him in the dark. This man who had been carrying his own guilt like a stone in his chest for 6 years, and had held himself at arm's length from everything that might require him to put it down. "You already started," she said. "That morning in the yard. When you told the truth in public." "That was you," he said. "You made it possible to say it." "No," she said firmly. "I made it visible that it needed saying. You said it. That was yours." She looked at her coffee cup. "Don't give me credit for your courage, Nate. It diminishes both of us." He was quiet for a moment. Then, fair. "What you just said to me," she said, "about carrying things like inheritance instead of burden. I need you to know that I heard that." She looked at him. "And I need you to know that I'm still not going to be rushed." "I know. But I'm also not afraid," she said. "I want you to know that too. Whatever this is, whatever it becomes, I'm not afraid of it." He looked at her steadily. "Neither am I." She held his gaze. Good. They sat with that for a while. The ranch settled into night around them, and inside the house Ruth was moving through her evening routine, and from the bunkhouse came the low sound of men talking. Comfortable and unhurried, and in the stable, Dominion moved in his stall with the slow, peaceful motion of an animal at rest. She rode him at first light. Not a training ride. She had ridden Dominion in training every day for 6 weeks. This was different. This was the ride that had no purpose except the riding which was her father had told her when she was 8 years old, and already in love with horses, the most important kind. She took him out through the east gate, past the canyon trail she had ridden in the dark with nothing but calculation and stubbornness, keeping her moving out onto the open range where the summer grass had gone golden at the tips, and the sky was the enormous, uncomplicated blue of a Wyoming morning before the heat arrived. Dominion moved under her, like something that had always known how to do this, and had only needed the right conditions to show it. Not the panicked speed of a frightened horse. Not the contained, correct movement of a trained one. Just a horse running because running was good, with a rider who understood the difference between direction and control, between asking and demanding, between a partnership and a performance. Clara let him run. Behind her, the ranch was getting up. She could hear it at the edge of the distance, the sounds of the morning beginning, the particular music of a working place that knew what it was doing. Caleb would be at the stable already. Price would be watching Caleb, still learning, still asking questions that were getting better every week. Ruth would have coffee made and breakfast in process, and eyes on everything the way she always did. Nate would be on the porch, probably with his first cup, watching the East Range, watching her. She thought about what her father had written, about what Garrett had said, about the letter in her pocket and the space waiting in the tack room, and the man on the porch and the horse beneath her running clean across the open ground. She thought about the girl who had carried a cavalry saddle across half of Wyoming, with nothing but the work ahead of her and the weight behind her, and how that girl had walked through a gate and been told no, and had stood her ground anyway, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had decided that fear was not the deciding thing. She had come here with her father's saddle and a dead man's name and a lie she'd told to survive. She was leaving those things behind. Not the saddle, not the name, never those, but the necessity of the lie. The need to be smaller than she was. The habit of hiding what she knew, because the world hadn't built enough room for it yet. Mercer Creek Ranch had built that room. She had helped build it. And it was hers now, in the way that things become yours, when you've worked for them and told the truth about them, and stayed when staying was the harder choice. Clara Whitmore rode Dominion across the open range in the Wyoming summer morning, and she was no longer a widow asking permission to survive. No longer a woman making herself small enough to fit through doors that weren't built for her. No longer a daughter carrying grief like a debt that could never be paid. She was herself. She was here. She was staying. And the whole of Mercer Creek Ranch knew her name.